All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Into the Cauldron. I'm Chris. Thank you for coming back in this thing yet again. I'm here today with a new guest. I'm very excited for it, Julian Vayne. And we were just talking about how exactly we can introduce Julian, because he is a man of a lot of different talents, chaos magic, going into shamanism, druidry, chaos magic, indigenous shamanism. He's done a lot of cool, amazing artwork recently, which has been very interesting. But he is evidently a man who defies any particular box, as I think is always good to good to be able to work with. So without further ado, I'm going to stop rambling and let us get on with it. So Julian, thank you for coming on, man.
Chris, thank you very, very much for inviting me. It's really appreciated. Looking forward to an interesting and rich conversation.
So, it's going to be great. I have no idea where this is going to go, so it's going to be very interesting. But I evidently tried to introduce you there. But for people who aren't familiar with you or your work at all, where would you sort of say is a good start for introduce what you do as a whole, I guess?
Okay, well, these days I actually did manage to get it together during the pandemic to put up a website, which is julianvayne.com, which has got like links to most of the stuff that I'm interested in. So I'm have been interested in the occult, the esoteric ever since I was a kid. I first got involved in group magical practice through Wicca back in the 80s, and was also quite early on involved in writing lots of kind of esoteric stuff. So I've written or co-authored, I think it's like 14, 15 books, something like this. And I'm also closely involved in the whole kind of psychedelic renaissance kind of scene. So I'm a co-organizer of a thing called Breaking Convention, which is Europe's largest psychedelic conference, which will be happening at Exeter University in April 2023. I've been a research participant in psilocybin trials, licensed psilocybin trials in a hospital in London. And that's kind of a really interesting and field that I'm engaged with at the moment. As you say, I've recently found myself doing lots of kind of visual art. Fortunate to have been invited to exhibit at the Trans States Conference in the university in Northampton, and doing an exhibition next year, kind of in the preparation, planning that something that's going to happen at St Ives in Cornwall. And I'm really interested in what I often describe as like open source magic. So I also do things like, I do work for the National Health Service. I do kind of well-being orientated stuff for some of the NHS. And a lot of what I do is stuff that I learn as magical practice, but it's kind of stripped out all the kind of weird jargon that's difficult for people to get their heads around. And find myself now doing things that, like I say, I kind of encountered first within the envelope of the Western Esoteric Tradition, but I believe that a lot of magical skills and the approaches that magic gives us to the experience of being, humans in this place, in this time, that these are really kind of empowering skills and practices, and that they should be kind of widely distributed and widely accessible. You take the example of something like, mindfulness meditation, and the way that over the course of the last couple of decades, that's kind of come into quite mainstream medicine. You look at the way that the Western Esoteric Tradition, and more broadly, the kind of the occult kind of story within various cultures includes the use of psychedelic drugs, and turns out now, with the second wave of research, that those things are therapeutic and beneficial for people, and that they don't necessarily have to be like some kind of card-carrying shaman or a dude with a crazy hat with feathers in to actually benefit from these things. So I'm really interested in accessibility of a lot of magical ideas. And while I've spent time, hanging out in the dark, tenebrous reaches of Kenneth Grant's work and the elaborate ceremonial structures of things like Western Golden Dawn style magic and Freemasonry, basically I like to think about like quite kind of direct approaches to this kind of stuff, and to while I appreciate the kind of the sort of the evocation of the mysterious that can exist within some of the texts that we have. I like things to be, pretty simple and straightforward. So, for example, I wrote a book, 2017, I think it came out, called Getting Higher, which was a manual of psychedelic ceremony. And the whole point about the book is that it's, I hope, very approachable for people. It's not predicated on some kind of elaborate metaphysical scheme or any particular belief system or series of deities or whatever. It's much more kind of nuts and bolts about how we might use these substances and we might enhance their effect and to bring out kind of different aspects of the way we might want to engage with them. So yeah, kind of accessible open source magic, I guess, is what I'm interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of it's leaning into the way I'm starting to go, honestly, because a lot of my background as when I was coming into it was more Golden Dawn ceremonial oriented, and I kind of had like a weird switch over the past 2 years because a lot of my training and practice over the past sort of 10 years or so was very focused in sort of Golden Dawn and ceremonial, mainly the Solomonic grimoire tradition, all that kind of thing. But in the past sort of 2 years, I kind of switched a little bit and went on a massive binge for doing like traditional folklore and traditional like folk magic and like cunning magic, that kind of thing, where sometimes psychedelics are engaged in folk craft and that kind of thing as well. And I'm loving it so much. It's like such an entirely different, much more practical, down-to-earth thing than ceremonial magic. Because I mean, there are tons of different ways of looking at it over whether you're going down like high magic or low magic, and whether those distinctions are actually even worth talking about in the first place at all. But it is like kind of cunning sorcery or practical magic. It has a different kind of flavor to it that I think is probably a lot more accessible to a lot more people. And it's such an interesting dichotomy of like, because I've seen different occultists all over the place kind of very get up each other's backs about the whole thing, going, oh well, but magic is only ceremonial, like high magic is the only real kind of magic, theurgy kind of stuff. And then you've got like the sort of the other cutting crop people like, well, no, like it's still a thing, and it's whether magic we're considering it as an actual technology in a system, or it's like, if you're going down more of like the chaos magic approach where there is some kind of psychological element to magic. And I guess with your approach, there is some kind of more open source psychedelic approach, right, or psychological approach.
I think it's ideally all of the above. I mean, the ontological status of these things, as per Aleister Crowley's remark in Magic and Theory and Practice, where he says, in this book are spoken of spheres and planes and spirits and things, whether they exist or not doesn't really matter. Do certain things, certain results follow. And sometimes those practices might look highly codified and ritualistic, and that might be great. And sometimes they may look very, very simple and immediate. So, for example, there is a huge value in processes such as banishing or centering rituals. Here I am doing the LBRP. Here I am, vibrating the Hebrew words and imagining the angels and all that kind of stuff. That's great, and that may mean that I feel like I'm cleansed and I'm ready and I'm centered and I can do whatever the practice is or whatever the process is that I'm doing, or maybe I'm just doing that as a standalone ritual. Ceremonial process in and of itself. Equally, I can go and stand in the shower and I can turn the shower on and I can recognize that, at least in my culture at the moment, I have the blessing of drinkable water, which is composed predominantly of hydrogen that was manifest allegedly according to our physics at the moment of the Big Bang, and oxygen that comes from the compressed internal structure of ancient dead stars that exploded out of the universe, giving rise to all the elements, including me, who now arises as an experiencing, conscious, aware entity, knowing that the shower itself is cleansing me and preparing me for whatever I'm going to do next. So a lot of it is attitudinal. A lot of it is like, what do we bring to the thing? Ceremonies and rituals are usually sequences of inhabited metaphors of one form or another. Sometimes those metaphors are really obvious. The shower cleans my body. That cleans all aspects of my body mind. Sometimes the codification is much more complicated. So I rap a certain number of times on the altar, and the way that I make these knocks indicative of which Kabbalistic sphere we are interested in engaging with at this particular point. much more obscure imagery, which might be just as powerful for me, particularly in that moment, particularly if I've worked with the system, particularly if that's my particular kind of shtick. But yeah, a lot of it is how we, what we're bringing to the party, and a lot of magic, I think, is this. It's like revealing what is there, and the magic of the everyday, which is a lot of what the kind of the folk tradition, I think, kind of points at. And I think that what the kind of high ceremonial magic tradition points at is things like the value in learning a complex system such as the Kabbalah or astrological correspondences or any of these kinds of things, which once you've internalized them are kind of just as easy. I mean, when I was a kid, I spent probably longer than is reasonable for a child of the age I was then, making big long lists of, Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Val, Zayn, Cheth, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is the fool. This is the magician. This is the priestess. That's the kind of stuff that I did. So I've got that as an internalized language. So for me, that's not actually particularly complicated as such, although it may look like that to somebody outside. So it also depends on, who's doing this practice. What's the intention? Is it a group process? Is it just an individual piece of solitary work, whatever? And those kind of, I don't know. I mean, like loads of people spend their time wandering around policing various borders of like, this is the high magic territory. This is the low magic territory. This is the cunning craft. I really have very little time for this, because firstly, whenever anyone tells me that they think they've got the answer to life, the universe, and everything, I'm immediately reminded of, the work of people like Douglas Adams and all of those kinds of, like, really, dude, right? You really think you've got this sorted? Like, I don't even know the ontological status of my hand, let alone anything else, And part of the point of calling it magic is, to some extent, magic is like a black box in the kind of the diagram of the flow diagram of one's life, where you go, don't know. It's like a weird thing that happens sometimes. And, we think we know some of the conditions under which we can optimize it. We think we know some of the strategies that we can use to kind of access it. What it is, how it works, whether it works, all of these things are uncertain. And if we're occultists, we like the uncertainty, because occultism, by its very definition, is the study of that which is hidden. And the thing that's hidden is always hidden. It's always the ever-receding mystery. It's not the equals, oh, here's the answer. That's not the point. The point is the process of this continuous exploration and, investigation, however we frame this, whether it's like a transcendental kind of reaching upwards or an archaeology of the deep nature of the universe, doesn't really matter. But it's that process that matters. Magic is a doing. It's not like just a concrete thing. I mean, frankly, everything is a doing. Everything is a process. It's only for convenience sake that we have this notion of discrete object.
Yeah, we can put things into boxes or whatever.
Yeah.
It's one of those things, because I was having a discussion in my community the other day about dualism and sort of cosmological dualism versus sort of philosophical dualism, because it's one of those things, like, you hear it in a weird amount of esoteric currents or esoteric disciplines, the amount of times the dualism or monoism and all that kind of thing comes up. It comes up, people have even argued that Plato was slightly dualistic, which I disagree with, or that Gnosticism is a dualistic heresy, which I also kind of disagree with. But it was a whole thing, and I was kind of going there, and I found one of the things, like, I can't remember if it's like epistemological dualism or ontological dualism, whatever it's called, where they had that kind of debate of, is the physical world and the things that we are seeing around us, is it inherently a thing in and of itself, that it actually physically exists, or is it just an internal creation from all of our sort of internal senses that is then projected out, and that's what we're seeing around us? It's like the undercurrent of like what we would call hologram simulation theory today, right? Where it's like, is all of this actually a thing that actually inherently exists, or is it just something that's coming up inside of us that we're articulating through other senses? And it's like that whole receding mystery of whether it is actually reality actually exists, or whether we are the reality that exists.
I mean, these are interesting questions, and I think that the process of asking those questions is really valuable. But I like to aspire to a kind of, radical agnosticism with a lot of this, in a kind of, Robert Anton Wilson kind of way. I've got suspicions about things, and there's things that I think this is probably the case. I mean, dualism, just thinking about that, there's there's that statement about there are two sorts of people in the world, those who believe there are two sorts of people and those who don't. I mean, we can create all kinds of interesting dualistic paradoxes, and most of this stuff is a little bit like a lot of those kind of ontological debates I often think are actually debates about topology, really. So there are people kind of worry, I'm a tube, essentially. I'm a series of tubes, interrelated tubes. In fact, pretty much all biology is a series of tubes. And arguably, if you go down to the string level, maybe the whole of reality is.
Yeah, well, the
point is, but the point is that I spend a lot of time worrying about what's outside the tube, what's inside the tube. Is this thing coming down or is this thing coming up? So a lot of the kind of conversations that we have about, is it inside me or is it outside in the world? That's basically a discussion about topology. And a lot of this kind of stuff is potentially fascinating kind of territory to explore. But I hesitate to imagine that there is an equal sign in this where some dude, whether it's an ancient initiate of the Eleusinian mysteries like Plato, or somebody who's going to pop up in the next 5 minutes who goes, I've got it sorted. Yeah. This is the answer. It's like, well, I don't know if the point was to get an answer necessarily. And also I think that a lot of the discussion is because it is topological, because it's about these beings in time having these discussions about, what's real, what's not real, the ontological status of things, that we're a little bit like flatlanders, in the kind of the flatland model where a sphere falls through their world one day and they're all arguing about, was it a dot? Was it a circle? What went on? Like a lot of the language that we use for these things begins to fall down, which is often why we reach towards poetic or mystical language. I mean, if you read the works of any number of different kind of mystics, let's call them for the moment, there's a point beyond which the language has to become this kind of paradoxical play, and it has to kind of point at things. So there's a in the work of May Deren, amazing avant-garde filmmaker, one of the first Westerners, white people to be initiated into a voodoo society in Haiti. She wrote an amazing book, Divine Horseman. And she talks in the book about the experience of being possessed by the Loa. And she talks about it as in terms of, I think her phrase is something like the descent of the white darkness. Now, it makes linguistic sense to talk about the descent of the white darkness. It's a sentence that, you can sort of, well, I understand that. It makes descending white darkness. I mean, what does that really mean? It's sort of also meaningless in some respects. However, beyond that, it points to something poetically, which certainly if you've ever done any possession work, you kind of go, oh yeah, I see what you're saying here. I get a sense of what you're saying. And so getting that deeper sense, I think, is possibly more valuable than worrying about, are the lower archetypal aspects within ourselves? Are they fundamental forces within the universe? Are they beings that exist within a different vibrational frequency of reality that we call through by our rituals or whatever? Yeah, I don't know. Nobody really knows. But experientially being able to kind of talk about it and be able to kind of allude to it in that poetic way, I think is much more interesting. Is there dualism? I suppose yes and no would be the obvious answer to something like that.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing actually. It reminds me again. I was having a discussion the other day actually, and this was a fun little thing. It was a new. I suppose we can call it a new technique for studying sort of poetry or studying the mystical text and that kind of thing. And it was something that one of my friends actually brought to me, because I'm sort of at the moment I'm mainly teaching some classes on like occultism, and I'm teaching some things about reading ancient texts and all that kind of thing. And one of my friends, because usually I teach in sort of this kind of like paradigm, right, or this kind of thing, where it's like I'm on Zoom, there's like a little PowerPoint up there, and I'm like going through a PowerPoint, whatever it is. And even I, I'll hold my hands up and be like, okay, I go way too academic with it sometimes. I'm like, okay, well, let's look at the ancient Greek. Let's look at the grammar. Let's look at this and see what it means. And I kind of missed the point, and I fully acknowledge that. But then one of my friends came to me and he was like, yeah, you were reading, I think it's actually like the Apocryphon of John, or like one of the Hermetic texts, something like that. And he's like, yeah, rather than actually like listen to all of the stuff that you were going on, I just sort of turned the lights out, put like you on audio repeat, and just listen to you like say all the imagery in this text, whatever it was. And I ended up in like incredible experience. It's like, and if you look at something like a Gnostic text or a Hermetic text, these things that would have been spoken in sermons, or they would have been spoken to a community of people, whereas like you kind of miss, and there is an element of the connection and the imagery that you miss if you're just reading the text itself. Whereas like if it's something that's being spoken to you as like an audio book, or like for a person, and you're obviously in, think about setting, that kind of thing as well, whether there's incense and candles, all that kind of thing going. And he was like, yeah, it's a whole, I had an entirely different experience when I was hearing the text being read to me, so I could focus on that was coming through. Because like it's one of those things, if we take Gnosticism as an example, a lot of Gnostic art, like a lot of the early Gnostics didn't make stained glass windows, where they didn't draw all their stuff going on. And by listening to that be read to you, it's an entirely different experience than you by reading the words. Whereas if it's being spoken to you and you're kind of having a more sort of visceral experience, you're connecting with what we can argue is, I guess, the deeper sort of mystical truth behind the text, because you're not being sort of consciously attached to it in that kind of way. So it's like one of the things that one of my friends, like he came to me, was like, yeah, we really should like make this more widely available, where like rather than reading texts, like ancient text or mystical text, listen to them spoken. And then as you're hearing them spoken, visualize the imagery that's coming in, because you're going to attach yourself, or you're going to feel a deeper dimension to the text than you would get if you were just reading it on paper or reading it in a book or a translation. It's like couple that even with substances and setting and everything as well, and then you're starting to understand where some of this like mystical truth begins to come from. And as you said, right, you, especially people who are coming at it from a more sort of experiential way, they understand things a little bit differently because they experience the text more directly rather than just reading it, if you know what I mean. It's kind of interesting.
I mean, let's look at it like this. I mean, let's imagine the some of the work of Shakespeare, for example. So there is a lot of value in going through the text and unpacking it so that you can see the clever wordplay, so that you can appreciate the way that the stuff is written, so that you can understand the words that perhaps you're not familiar with, and the references that are not current references but would have been very, very commonly understood at the time. That's great. And then you go and see the play. These are two different, and these are two aspects of understanding, for example, the text. And of course, the latter, the experience of actually seeing the play, is what the text was intended to do. The text was not intended primarily as a lovely kind of hermeneutic exercise of kind of analysing. So what's the author trying to say here? What's really going on with this? What are the current allusions? Those things are meant to be kind of experientially understood, or not, as the case may be, because of course, generally with a text we can return to it multiple times. That's one of the delightful things about it. When we return to a text, I remember reading the Tao Te Ching when I was a kid, essentially, and going, this is kind of weird, it's kind of cool, it's kind of weird, it's kind of cool, I don't really get it, it's kind of cool, I think it's probably really good, I don't really know. And like basically 40 years on, I have essentially the same response. Arguably it's a little more informed with a knowledge of the history of like Taoism, and it's got a little bit more kind of nuance in it. And there are certainly bits of it that I read now, I just go, this is amazing. And I'm reading it in translation. So, I mean, I don't know like how, potentially even more awesome it is in the kind of, the original, if I was actually kind of part of that language community. So the fact that we can return to these things, the fact that we can study these things, and that, I guess maybe that is even like going back to your thing about like the folk magic and ceremonial magic, you know, the aspect of magic where we study a text. You know, here we are. We've decided that gematria is absolutely the thing. You know, we've read, you know, I don't know, some of the Kenneth Grant material is brilliant for that, because it's just so stuffed full of all this bonkers stuff. I remember seeing an article once about mathematical errors that were in Kenneth Grant as well, which is quite entertaining. So, you know, there we are with all these kind of like numbers, and, you know, 333 plus this equals the number of the beast, Shugal Chazar. Amazing. It's a great way of exploring the world. You know, it's fantastic. Yeah. It's fantastic. And for a certain kind of person, it really, really rocks their world. And it's really engaging and fabulous. And of course, one of the other ways of reading, say, Kenneth Grant, is just to read it like sort of Arthur Machen, to read it like some kind of evocative, like H.P. Lovecraft. Like, this dude is just trying to weird me out with all these things that don't actually make any sense. And that's kind of the point. That's actually what he's trying to achieve, you know, to create this idea that, you know, in this mauve zone that allows us access to the Mioan, we will find ourselves falling through the tree of life into this other parallel. I mean, it's bonkers, completely bonkers, and beautiful and great fun. And we can analyze the text. We can analyze any sacred book, and we can look at the gematria. We can study, and study is a legitimate part of the magical project. It's you know, people kind of go, "Oh, it's just an armchair magician." It's like, no, man. Like it's. I mean, Thoth, Odin, all these people, Hermes, they're gods of writing. They're gods of writing, right? So writing is cool. Writing is superpower magic. Like, writing can carry someone's spirit and their intentions and their thoughts across generations, across millennia, across linguistic groups in translation, and so on. So studying text is really valuable. And then hearing poetry read aloud, and then using the texts in ritual contexts, whether that ritual context is a complex ceremony or whether or not it's like, there's a poem by Gerald Gardner that I've committed to memory, which is about the moon. And often when I see the moon and I'm moved to do so, I say the poem to the moon, you know,
because very kind of Orphic hymn of you as well.
Hymn before. Yeah. It's nice. It's just, it's like so the text becomes for me a way of responding to the world as much as a way of like setting something into the world. You know, it's just lots of different ways of doing it. And that's the delicious thing about magic. It has, you find people who are deeply involved in this practice who, you know, their thing is like totally Solomonic magic, you know, arcane research. You know, does it have to be at this planetary hour? All the planetary hours, do they vary depending on the length of daylight? Do I have to, or are they purely divisions of the actual 24-hour clock? Or should I be doing it, of course, according to like the lunar periodicity rather than solar? I mean, all of these tiny little, and some people, that's their thing, right? Yeah. This is like the kind of, you know, magic for the train spotter community. And that's great. That's great. You know, I want those people to be involved. Fantastic. They have special powers, you know. Of course I want their cities in the mix. And I also want those kind of like really free form experimental people who often we describe as artists primarily, who are then, you know, you look at their work, you go, oh, Jackson Pollock, turns out you were really, really fascinated by the occult. Oh, you know, all these, and those kinds of characters are also able to access this same territory, but just through a different mechanism.
Yeah, because like it always it's one of those things that I have always been a bit interesting, because my background, even before magic, was in archaeology, believe it or not. So my degree is actually in archaeology. That's how I kind of got into magic. So I sort of ended up specializing in religion, or archaeology of religion and funerary stuff, which then led me to ceremonial magic, and then kind of springboarded from there. But I kind of, as I've kind of traced the history back, because obviously the Solomonic stuff and everything, like, I mean, even Stephen Skinner makes the argument that it goes back to the PGM and the Greek magical papyri and stuff like that. It's like all of that emerges in sort of a very sort of, you know, powerful current, or it's in its own little container and box that then everything grows out of. And it's like, the more, as an archaeologist, or like from a historical standpoint, you go back and back and back, eventually you reach, the Stone Age, something like that, with the sort of the Paleolithic shamans in their caves or whatever, with the fires and probably different kinds of fungi and stuff like that. It's like they didn't care about like where Mars was in the sky. They didn't really give a shit about like what like our Saturn was in or anything like that. They're like, okay, right, I have something that's going to be good for the tribe, or I want to know something. I'm going to go into this cave, and the fungi spirits are going to let me out of the cave when they're done with me, and then I will have my experience, and then that's that. They didn't worry about it too much.
I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it, and possibly true. It's also, I would suggest, the case that it is hard to know with those cultures that don't codify things in writing in the way that we understand it. They may have incredibly elaborate oral history genealogies. They may have, creation legends that go on for days that have to be retold by bards. There may be all kinds of really very rich and complex cosmologies, which we only really notice when people start writing it down. So if you take, for example, Vajrayana Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, and you look at the really rich panoply of different, deities and ideas and ritual practices and so forth, a lot of these are codified now because they're written, but many of them draw, as I understand it, historically, heavily on Bonpa and the earlier forms of indigenous shamanism, of that whole kind of, Tibetan plateau up into Mongolia, up into Siberia, northwestern Europe, northeastern Europe, and so forth. Eurasia. So they may not have cared where Mars was, but also they may have had actually really quite elaborate ritual practices that there would be little or no way of us really understanding. And certainly we also know that there was probably a great diversity. There are many, many examples where we can look at, there's a tendency, I think, to kind of homogenize the past and say, all of these people were all doing this kind of thing. And actually, where we go and look at lots of, Papua New Guinea is the classic example because of the landscape, because of the relative difficulty in moving across some of that landscape, and looking at the way that different communities, who are only a matter of a few miles apart, have incredibly different cultural structures.
Yeah,
and then of course you realise that the cultural structure you see is just a little snapshot you have at the point where Western anthropologist turns up. Oh, I'm going to look at your culture. Oh, look, this is how your culture is. It's like, no, this is how the culture is on the day that you met the particular people that you spoke to, that told you about the culture, who, of course, frankly, could even be joking with you. It's like, oh, yeah, this is how it is.
Yeah, this is how we're going to troll them. Yeah.
Yeah. And all of so this is this. It's actually like a really, human beings are incredibly creative, incredibly adaptable, and that is both their bane and their blessing in many respects. Yeah. Our Neolithic shaman may have been doing any number of things. They may well have been sitting there in the corner going, I can't do it yet. The red star's not up.
Yeah,
no, it's just not. It's not possible. It's not possible. Can't do it. Who knows?
Yeah, it reminds me as well. Have you ever looked into Dr. Lynn Kelly's work?
Oh, now the name rings a bell, but I can't immediately call it to mind.
Yeah, she's done a lot of the reason I'm bringing up is she's done a lot of work on psychogeography, and she works with mainly indigenous memory systems. And I actually had her on for the podcast a couple months ago, and it was such an interesting discussion because she sort of makes a distinction between a lot of the way we conceptualize memory and really our conceptualize the world right now from a Western standpoint comes from sort of the Socratics and the Greek philosophers and that kind of thing. We use maybe the mind palace technique sometimes, which is what Cicero used and that kind of thing. But if you go to, I say back, that's probably the wrong word. If you go to indigenous cultures, their memory it's more of a learned memory. They experience their memory and all their experience somatically through the body, or they associate different areas of the landscape with different things with different memory structures. So they can actually end up, you're looking into something like indigenous Australians, so Aboriginal cultures. certain people in those cultures have, 300-400 kilometers or miles worth of things entirely memorized, and they can walk the entire breadth of Australia like by memory, because they've attached different landscape memory things to everything. And she was kind of saying something similar, where she had, I can't remember what she called them. But they're these little like material things, and they have like, think of it like a plank of wood with like little beads and shells.
Yes, I know.
Kind of put up
Tyson the Younger Porter talks about these as well, I think, in Sand Talk, if memory serves. Yeah,
they're all over the place. But it's like she showed me on the podcast. She sort of picked one up, and it was just like, it was a board, and it had like little bits of shells or beads or whatever like put to it. And he was like, "Yeah, this thing is an encyclopedia of like 300 different birds, and I can name every single one off by heart in the next 10 minutes if you want me to, just by touching the bead." And it's like, and there were different ways of like attaching meaning and things to these different things, whether it was by color, by shape, whatever it was. And she was like, yeah, this is also why places like sacred places, take, we used to call it Ayers Rock, right? But Uluru in Australia. It's like, this is why places like that are so sacred, because the whole way it's structured is the higher up you go, the more knowledge is revealed by the landscape. It's like the stories that we get as Westerners or anthropologists or whatever, they're the stories that are told to children, because it's the mythological, the mythological kind of fun stories. So from our perspective, we're like, oh, it's so primitive. There's no culture to it. There's no system, whatever it is. And then you actually go in and you're initiated into those systems, right? And you look into it, and it's something, a lot of time the mythology is codifying some element of actual knowledge that is then passed down through generations over 1,000 years, and the memories remain consistent again and again and again. And it's like, it was such a weird thing that blew my mind about it. And it puts like it filled in so many gaps, even in magical practice, where I was like, oh, so like so much of magic is inherent in the landscape and how we move and our relation to the world around us and how we conceptualize the world around us, whether it's through memory or for anything else. It's like putting that into, I don't know, even in the mind of like a Neolithic shaman, like we were saying, right? We are still kind of imposing our bias back onto them, because we're saying, oh, well, they didn't have a cultural structure that we say works in this kind of way. It's like power, for example, when people come in and they say, oh, there's egalitarian societies, there's all these things, all the things. It's like, yeah, well, because they didn't value the same things as you did, right? They may value power in that sense, or knowledge in that sense. And that's the hierarchy that exists in that society, rather than material goods and that kind of thing. There's like the amount of experience that is passed down through memory that's inherent in the landscape and our relationship to the landscape is another huge discussion, I guess.
David Weber and Wengrow and Graeber, their book, The Dawn of Everything. Fantastic example of looking at, indigenous or and particularly the kind of cultures of the Americas. And one of the things that kind of comes out from the book, and the book is open to criticism, and there's been critiques since it came out a few years back, but I think there's some pretty solid stuff in there, because the overriding message is that, look, humans have always been much more complex, much more interesting, much more diverse than you imagine.
Yeah.
And kind of joking there about the kind of the train spotter occultists who love their, the detail of the PGM. Those people, that style of human will have existed within indigenous Australian culture, Aboriginal cultures, and pretty much every other place, because humans being humans, we only really work as a group. We can't work as individuals. Even however solitary we might be, the very language that we use to organize our thoughts has been given to us by our ancestors, however good, bad, or indifferent. So our very cognitive structure is one that's part of a shared system. And the very fact that we have to acquire language before we hit puberty suggests that language itself might have been developed within children's culture, which is also kind of an interesting thought about this. So we are these deeply relational beings, and so you would expect, of course, within the ancient Mayan cultures, or within the cultures that will exist in 500 years' time, to have individuals who have systems of memory, ways of organizing and orientating themselves to the world, which the culture may or may not value, may or may not utilize within the way it encodes data. And we do this now. I mean, if you look at people who might identify as being on the autistic spectrum, and then you look at people who are incredibly good at coding JavaScript, it's not perhaps unsurprising that there is sometimes a significant match between some of those groups, because there are and until such time as coding JavaScript was even a thing, here you are wandering around in the 14th century in Europe. That's not. But there may be something else, or here you are wandering around around Uluru, and you're the person who's capable of picking up this board and going, right, so what this means is all these things, and so it's also like how good cultures are at utilizing and embracing the kinds of humans that we find within our communities. Another good example is we have this thing of unfortunately sort of medicalizing, sometimes for good reason, but often not. Things like attention deficit, attention hyperactivity, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
There you go.
And the thing about this is that, oh, look, a squirrel, right? That's the behavior. Yeah. So here I am, I'm supposed to be on task, and suddenly I'm pulled off by something else and my attention goes elsewhere. That, under certain circumstances, is an incredibly valuable thing to have within your community. Here you are as, the classic hypothesized ancient Mesolithic hunting party, for instance. Let's imagine that. That person who notices, the bird has moved from here to there. Well, we're not looking for birds, yes, but the bird has moved from here to there because a predator has moved a couple of miles back, or the fire is moving through this area, or the wind has changed, and therefore I notice this and I can inform people. So do we build these kinds of cognitive structures into our culture more or less successfully? Cultures do it in lots of different ways. Sometimes we completely other it and we say, no, people who do stuff with their left hand, they're sinister and bad, and we don't want anything to do with this. And in other cultures, we say, people who write with their left hand, they are specially magic and they are specially powerful and they're to be respected, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, it's one of those things I think I've read. And this is like a little. I suppose it's a bit of a little controversial area to get into, but it's interesting nonetheless. When we've had, I've read numerous articles at this point of even anthropological accounts where indigenous people have come into like how or seen how we treat people in psychiatric hospitals, or people who are undergoing what we would in our society consider mental illness, and they have an entirely different perspective on what that is, because the way psychogenic illness or anything like that is handled in indigenous societies is something that's entirely different. And it's such an interesting way of when you look at it, because it reminds me like one of my friends is actually ADHD as well, and his when I watch his thought pattern of how he gets to different places, it's such an interesting little thing to look at, like how it's different. It's like, I remember this one day, we were like ages ago, we went to some kind of fairground, whatever it was, and we ended up getting like ice cream or chocolate, whatever it was there, and he ended up getting stung by it was like a bee or a wasp, something like that. And there was this other day that we were like it was like months ago, where we were talking about it, and we were talking about like ice cream or something like that. And then he suddenly went, "Oh yeah, I remember. I like the color yellow, and I remember the color yellow." I was like, "How did you get from ice cream to yellow?" Like it's like there's no logical step. It's like, well, we were doing ice cream, we were having ice cream, and then a wasp came in, and then I got stung. So I remembered the feeling of getting stung, and then now I associate that feeling of getting stung with the color yellow. So then I asked if you have the same feeling about the color yellow. So it's like that kind of thing, like those kind of like logical jumps that come across all the ways. It's like that. It doesn't occur to people who are sort of, I guess we would say, like neurotypical, right? But as you were saying, it's the complexity and that, like, just like it's like kind of like cultural soup that exists, where there's so many different people and so many different ways of looking at the world, that is what creates that beautiful kind of dynamic existence that we have. Like that diversity that we have is what makes us inherently human, right? And that's what makes it so exciting.
And that's looping back to that thing about dualism or whatever. It's like,
right.
What's the answer? The answer is that there are probably multiple answers. There are multiple answers. This thing about there may be no ultimate truth and anything may prove possible. And silly throwaway phrases like that, which just kind of point towards, again, for me as an occultist, the unbounded nature of the human experience. Like there's always that which eludes definition, formal construction, and that's good. That's part of like kind of what we're about as a kind of creature as well. We are these investigative beings imbued with consciousness, which is basically a problem-solving structure. I'm cold. Oh, I need to put my jacket on. I'm hungry. Right, I need to visit the refrigerator. That's what consciousness is for. It's basically to sort the body out and to service its needs by understanding what the problem is, and then individually or more likely collaboratively trying to fix the problem. So, we are these really. You can kind of see why within a number of different religious frameworks and structures that human beings are given this kind of very peculiar status. Not necessarily that they're specially good, although often within some of the kind of religious envelopes they are seen as being in the image of God and
sure, yeah,
particularly kind of important from that point of view. But certainly we are a really, really weird thing. We're a really weird being. Here we are on this remarkable planet doing this kind of stuff. And I think that one of the things that magic as a field of inquiry or a practice kind of points at is it is about exploring the boundaries and the borders of this kind of stuff. Where is the limit of what the imagination is capable of? We know it's capable of changing what we often would refer to in a somewhat depressing Descartesian way as the body by placebo. We know that we can take and we also know that nocebo effect is also equally real and pervasive and powerful. So the very messages that we tell ourselves can have material effects, at least in us as individual bodies. And we know that the vast majority of our cultural structure are a series of interpenetrating intrasubjective imaginal things, right wing versus left wing. Which wing? Where is this wing of which we speak? Yeah. It's a conceptual structure. It's not a literal thing at all. It's an imaginal thing. What about money is another classic example. Identity, all of this kind of stuff. And magic is a repertoire of techniques for exploring the boundaries and the borders of where this imagination operates and trying to kind of empower us through learning these techniques and these methods to at least tinker with the edges of this stuff, at least to explore and to find out a little bit about what it might mean for us in our particular circumstances.
Yeah, on that note, then I think it's an interesting one. It's something I've been sort of thinking about recently. And I suppose in a similar spirit of making it more accessible, sort of open source magic, I guess we can say. There's a lot of talk at the moment, especially in those kind of big self-help circles or mindfulness circles of personal transformation or sort of personal growth and that kind of thing. And I'm kind of sitting here like we have this system of magic that exists, right? We have this entire beautiful system that, as you said, is for exploring these other bounds that are inherently, we could argue more mystical to a certain extent. And I'm always curious to what extent magic as a system can be used for personal transformation or sort of personal empowerment and that kind of thing, whether it's getting to know yourself more or getting to know your own boundaries more, or just personal growth and personal change as a topic as a whole. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I think if I'm understanding it correctly, I would say that these are, again, to talk in topological terms, maybe these are two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
In as much as if we rock up to the Delphic Oracle and there's the big sign saying "Know thyself" carved in one of the pillars, and we think, "Oh, that seems like a jolly good idea." But also, we're going to the Delphic Oracle to go and seek the Oracle to get some advice from an apparently external source. Of there's the Hesphode and there's the person ranting away in the corner and it being turned into iambic pentameter verse, on the fly by this genius. But brilliant. I mean, absolutely brilliant. So, I mean, the process of understanding who we are and of then transforming that, these things kind of go hand in hand. So, for example, one of the communities of practice that I'm part of, the Magical Pact of the Illuminates of Thanateros, which is a triple word score in Scrabble, is one of the things we do as part of the program of study for people who are kind of becoming involved in the network is that they do a thing called they do a metamorphosis. So they take a minor habit of some description and they change the minor habit. And sometimes people go for grand things like, I'm going to give up smoking, I'm going to change, whatever. But it can be usually something really simple, like, I don't know, which sock you tend to put on first in the morning, something like this. And the point of that exercise is to sort of demonstrate to yourself that the self who you identify yourself as is a lot more fluid than you might believe. And that also, not only is it more fluid, but rather bizarrely, the self who is the self you identify as is capable of putting into place a practice which will transform the self who's decided to undertake the practice. So you then start putting on a different sock first in the morning. Yeah. Or you start, you have a series of different behaviors. So is this about like self-empowerment? Well, yes, in a sense, because I'm learning that I have more agency in the world than perhaps I believed before. Is it about self-transformation? Yes, clearly, because I'm now putting on my left sock first rather than my right sock. I have changed an observable behavior in the world. And perhaps if I choose to change a behavior that has more importance, more significance, I might be making myself a better person in some sense. So yeah, I mean, these things feed off each other. That's exactly that's what they should do, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I think ultimately it comes down to the biggest philosophical question of them all, and that what do we mean by self? Right? What is the self that we're talking about here? Which is there are so many answers. Whether there is the unchanging self, as was it a lot of the Vedic stuff tends to go, or if there is sort of the anatta doctrine of Buddhism, where there is a no self, when it's just the energy that's sort of reincarnated over lifetimes or anything like that, and if there is even a reincarnation process. Well, I don't know. It's I don't know. It's one of those things. I don't at this point in my life. I'm starting to question whether there is kind of an underlying self that is kind of the thing that we base everything else on. I'm kind of starting, as you said, like in my own experience, especially with magic, it's starting to I'm leaning more to the phrase like our self, whatever that is such in constant fluidity and in flux so much that there is no way of saying that there is a underlying sort of Cartesian self, I guess we can say, anymore.
It's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think that when we talk about this kind of this notion of the self, whether or not we have this kind of Atman diamond point, this unbreakable atom in a kind of classical sense that's like the fundamental building block, or whether or not there is this absence. I mean, I kind of like some of the kind of tantric stuff where we talk about the idea that everything lives in awareness. So like awareness as being the underlying ground of all being. And sometimes we have an awareness of what we call self, and sometimes we have an awareness of the fluidity and the porous nature and the changeability of the thing that we identify as self, which is usually more or less located within the body. I think that one of the things that magic as a discourse, certainly in its kind of like modern iteration, modern, Euro-American, Western iteration, describes, and again, Crowley kind of points at this with his work, as do many others, which is that it's not whether or not there is or is not a self, it's what strategy might we use to discover or explore or to influence the things that we're interested in at any given moment. So at the moment, you are a small square on a computer screen in a room in my house, and I perceive your words coming out of your mouth. They're actually coming from the speaker that's at the bottom of the screen that I'm using here. But in order for us to have this conversation, I'm not going to go, Chris, you see, he's not really a self. He's actually like a glorious absence, like a Kia around which is currently flowing. It's not going to help. I'm going to relate to you as a self from the perspective of being perhaps another identifiable self-arising being, because I want to use the hominid wetware that I've got, which is incredibly good at reacting to other things that look broadly the same as me, and yet I suspect have internal worlds that are similar and but nevertheless different.
Mm.
There may be other occasions where letting go of the self, here I am, I know I'm in a profound psychedelic experience, and I'm concerned and worried that the acid is going to completely overwhelm my identity, and I will go mad, or whatever it is I'm concerned about at the time. And under those conditions, actually kind of opening and letting go of the things that we grasp onto, that we identify as the things that make me, that strategy in that moment is the best way of approaching that particular experience. And very likely, when the medicine wears off, I will come back to a sense of an identifiable, being in the world.
Thing, yeah.
But it's about tactics. It's about tactics, really, rather than these kind of concerns about what the absolute meaning might be. And I don't know. The different those different views, again, when we start to get like fine grain with this, it's there are loads of really interesting examples of this where you sort of start to go to I remember reading some material from the Temple of Set, and reading about their idea of the isolate self, their idea of like this kind of radically separate kind of sovereign identity, I suppose would be one of the phrases that we might use to describe it. And that's great. And there's a lot of kind of really interesting stuff in that, a lot of like really good kind of, thought and scholarly interest and work that people have done within this notion of an isolate self. The thing is, if you carry on the line of reasoning, and this is assuming that reason itself is a valuable tool to find out the answer to stuff. But if you carry on the line of reasoning, you start to go, this sense of self that you're talking about, this isolate sense of self, it's starting to sound a bit like, I don't know, God. Or it's starting to sound a bit like the Tao, like the inner nature. There's Aleister Crowley wandering around going, oh, you must do your will, brackets, by the way, your will sounds awfully like your inner nature. So it isn't even really what you want. Your will isn't really what you want necessarily. It's what you're kind of destined to do. It's your doom or your weird in a kind of Anglo-Saxon kind of a sense.
Yeah.
So is it a self? Again, we start to enter kind of like a debate, which is, for me, it's fundamentally topological. It's like, is it inside and radically isolated, or is it like outside? I mean, interesting territory.
Yeah.
And worth exploring. Whether there is an answer as such, I am uncertain.
Yeah. I think uncertainty or probability is probably the best way to look at it, which is another sort of classical chaos magic way of looking at things, I suppose. Because I mean, like that is the kind of idea that's found, like you mentioned Kia there, like earlier. And that is kind of the central idea that's found in things like Peter Carroll's work, even to a certain extent, Spare's stuff. Whereas like Kia is sort of the ultimate probability of untapped potential that exists in everything, everywhere, and in any given moment. I would also be curious to sort of bridge some gaps a little bit here, because I remember earlier you said, which is something I'm really curious about, that you participated in some of the early sort of psychedelic trials and things as well. So what effect has, I guess, psychedelics had on, or I guess psychedelics in general, medicine in general, had on your perception of the self or your perception of self? Because I mean, we talk about ego death and stuff all the times, and there are debates over whether a complete ego death is actually a healthy thing for a human being, or whether it's something we should claim. Because it's one of those annoying things. I've seen it. You see it in all kind of like pop new agey spirituality. It's like they're going, "Oh, we need to trigger an ego death. It's horrible." It's like, okay, well, back up a little bit, right? So I wonder what your sort of your 2 cents is on it. But
I know. I mean, firstly, the statement, this is what you need, young man, is you need an ego death. Yeah. That itself is hugely problematic for all the obvious reasons. Like, hang on, who are you to tell me? And who is this me? What is this ego of which you speak as well? I mean, these things are often incredibly poorly defined. Yeah. And not to say that like a coherent definition would necessarily kind of even advance the project a lot. What a lot of people are talking about is they're talking about this idea of radically letting go of identity, because that's the thing that, depending on what you're taking, what circumstances and how much, experience of psychedelics is often that thing of like the what's often described, in my opinion, kind of erroneously for other reasons that we may get to explore, the default mode network state. So the state that you get with a human being when you stick it in an fMRI scanner and you don't ask it to do anything, and it sort of spends its time thinking about the past and the future and wondering about when it's going to finish and what time dinner is and things like this. That state, which we can imagine as being the ego, that state, when you stick a bunch of psilocybin into that brain, what will happen is that default mode network structure is radically changed. Lots of new neuronal connections happen. You start to be able to see the music because the bits that deal with visual perception, the bits that do with auditory perception are suddenly cross-linked, which doesn't normally happen. But interestingly, there is still an awareness. And that's one of the really interesting things about it. I mean, if you take an example of another medicine or another sacrament, we could call it drug, psychedelic drug, 5-MeO-DMT, which the most readily sourced organic form is obviously from the Sonoran desert toad, which is itself incredibly cool. I mean, this is a toad that lives in the desert. Brilliant. Yeah. So 5-MeO-DMT is often an experience which people talk about in terms of like, ego dissolution, ego death, and those kinds of things. The interesting thing about it, though, is that obviously if you push any substance to a high enough level, you get amnesia, you'll get unconsciousness by and large. You get this thing where everything kind of whites out and there's kind of no content, there's no self to perceive what's going on. But even something like 5-MeO, and even at sort of, relatively high dosage, there is a sense of an awareness. There's a sense of like this, I think Peter Sosthead-Hughes, the psychedelic philosopher, talks about this. He talks about the experience of how normally when we think of consciousness, with phenomenology, we think of consciousness of, I'm conscious of the fact that I'm on a podcast. I'm conscious of the fact that I'm sitting on a chair, but this is like consciousness, but without like an object. It's just pure awareness. Is that an ego death? Well, there's still memory happening because I will still remember some aspects of this experience. So clearly it's and it's still presumably happening in the 2.5 pounds of electrified fat up here. So at least, chemically speaking. Is ego death beneficial? I think what's beneficial is to enter these experiences and being open to the possibility of change and transformation. Otherwise, why would we even bother doing this? I don't think it's necessarily the case that just because you've taken a big bucket load of shrooms or chugged, a couple of pints of ayahuasca, you are necessarily any more sorted, any better. In fact, I can point, unfortunately, to plenty of examples of people.
I was going to say,
exactly those things.
I know a good amount of people who are not better off from taking ayahuasca.
Turned out to be total dicks. Or at least have found themselves on occasion behaving in ways that I do not appreciate myself. Let's put it like that, a bit more gently. However, the experience of taking a moderate dose of MDMA and going out with your friends dancing and having this sense of like group unity and bliss and ecstasy, that may not have involved an ego death. Was it a more beneficial experience for you and your community? Well, quite possibly, yes. Quite possibly, yes. So again, the simple equivalence, take drugs equals ego death equals sorted out and becomes Buddha. No, nonsense. Again, if it was that simple, we could, we could just, have these things as straightforward processes that everyone would go through when they hit 18 or whatever, and we'd be.
If we have an entire society of Buddhas, that's it.
Exactly. No, it's again much more complex than that. So for me, one of the values of psychedelics is that they demonstrate, again, rather like that example of the metamorphosis technique, they demonstrate the flexibility of cognition, awareness, the way that we sense and understand the world. They also open up these opportunities to see things in new ways, and that's fundamentally what they do. They're actually if you had to say what is a psychedelic, one way of understanding it, particularly if it's curated in a supportive way, is that it's a mechanism for accelerated learning, of which healing is a subset. So when you have trauma, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder, and you go and do MDMA therapy with, MAPS or whoever you're doing it with in the States or whatever the protocol is, the trauma doesn't go away. The trauma is not remembered any longer. What happens is that you see the trauma from a new perspective, and that allows you to be with it, and sometimes even to transform it in such a way that it empowers you and maybe the people around you. So you have learned something new. And there are plenty of examples of some really interesting experiments with looking at conventional styles of learning touch typing on LSD. So that was something that was tried in the 1950s and 1960s. And the answer is it works really well. Looking at the polymerized chain reaction, which was, according to the dude who invented it, an insight that he came up to with LSD. The Watson and Crick story with DNA is almost certainly not true, but there are certainly much more well-attested to stories of some of the techniques that we use in computing, notably things like the mouse and cut, copy, and paste, have been inspired by people who were using psychedelics. So they are ways of thinking about things in very radically different ways. And healing is part of the aspect of that, but also that self-inquiry, that know thyself. It means that we get a chance to see ourselves and our own cognition and our own awareness from a radically different perspective. And potentially that's really valuable. Potentially that's really, really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. What do you make of all those people who end up sort of, taking, a bucket load of ayahuasca or whatever and come back thinking they're Jesus, or they sort of had some kind of, revelatory experience and that kind of thing? Because I've met a couple of them, and they're an interesting bunch. I mean, it's because clearly people are experiencing something revelatory. They're experiencing something transformative while on these medicines. But then when it comes back to the integration, that sense of self that it's such like a fundamentally different sense of self that they struggle with the integration a little bit.
I think a lot of that comes down to what the Buddhists would refer to as the Sangha, the community of practice. And that's why things like what you're doing with the podcast and the teaching that you're doing, the stuff that I do, is really important when we talk about magic, because magic, we can do this as individual practitioners, and there's a great value in that. But we are social beings. Like I said, even our language is given as a gift given to us by our ancestors. So when those folks go off and take the bucket load of ayahuasca, have the revelation that, they are Quetzalcoatl, to take an example of a writer who I won't bother naming, and then they come back and then they leave their wife and they decide that they need to go off and teach their great message to the world, which turns out to be of, in my opinion, little or no interest. So those people generally don't have a very good Sangha. They don't have a very good community of practice around them. They don't have peers who are capable of saying, look, Dan, just chill, man. Like, yes, of course, you're the son of God. Man, everyone is the son of God. Like, even, and like listening to that as an actual thing. One of the difficulties with going and having those experiences is that they are often decontextualized. We've gone off to Mapia or Iquitos or wherever we've gone to. We've gone far away from our world. We come back having had this radical experience, and it's kind of like, I think, perhaps the first time that you have sex, and you sort of, you leave wherever it was that you just had been making love with your partner, and you think, I must look different. It must be the same. Probably everyone can tell that I've just had sex for the first time.
You've got the little strut.
I've got and it's like, everyone else is like, no, we're not interested in your thing at all. It's whatever. What I often think of these as like, it's about avoiding your own glass spider moment, right? So David Bowie, back in the late 80s, produced an album called Never Let Me Down, which is all about the glass spider. I saw him on the Glass Spider tour. Massive album, like massive tour, absolutely rubbish music. In fact, when he put his discography, I think, and launched his own website, he actually dropped the album and from the list of the stuff that he'd done, and he never ever played any of the songs after the tour live in any performance ever again. Now, the glass spider moment for me in my head is like, Dave has taken so much coke and he's so excitable. And he's like, oh, we're going to do this thing. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be like all this story about a glass spider. It's going to be like a kind of prog rock kind of 80s kind of and it's getting worse and worse and worse. But because he hasn't got a decent community to say, Dave, this is rubbish.
Yeah.
This is not any good. Don't do this, Dave. You'll regret this in the future. So he goes off and does all this thing. And then, of course, N years later, he looks back at this. If you go and have a look at the Wikipedia entry on the glass spider, you'll see he himself says some not very nice things about his work during that period.
Mm.
And I'm a great David Bowie fan, which is part of the reason I know this. So
Sure.
It's like, yes, of course, you can go off and have these revelations. Yes, of course, you can go off on one. But that's the reason that you have a community. You have a community so that it can be, to some extent, a stabilizing influence on you. That's part of what it's for. Mm. Yes, of course, sometimes we've got to break out. We've got to go on our own way. We've got to go on our own hero's journey and adventure and blah. That's fantastic. But definitely, if we've come back from our hero's journey, telling everyone that now we know what's going down and that we're sorted and you should just sit down and listen to me, it's like, I don't know, man. I've heard this before. I can point to loads of examples in history where, dude has come down from the mountain and said, I'm going to tell you how to live. And sometimes there's some good stuff in that. Absolutely. Often, there are problems with it as well.
Yeah.
And often those problems end up with things like abuses of power. They end up with, really quite kind of unsavory stuff that then, because there are always people who are in a point in their process where they are looking for the answer, and they are quite cheerfully able to say, that person over there's got the answer. I want some of that action. I want to be part of that. I want to be like a disciple. I want to be a supporter. I want to be, again, there's no blame on any of these people. This is just like a game that humans play. It's part of our story. But if we can have strategies for interrupting that, and the big strategy for interrupting that is to be part of a community where you are part of a group of equals, where people can pull you up and stuff, call you out, where they can also remind you of things that maybe you should be thinking about. Okay, so you've got this great answer to life, the universe, and everything. That's fantastic. What does that mean in terms of all these other aspects of your life? What does that mean for you? What does that? Do you feel that your answer is necessarily also my answer? And just asking questions like that, I think, can be really helpful to prevent this stuff spiraling out of control.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And it's when things do, when they do spiral out of control, that's when you get things like new religious cults and stuff like that, where you get these sort of things surrounded by charismatic leaders and that kind of thing, right? Which is then, yeah, no, I completely agree. Having a community around you is so important, not only for initiation, but I think, not initiation, for integration rather. But then also, I think one of the benefits of having or constructing, I guess what we could say is sort of a contemporary initiatory system or a contemporary kind of community system is you are in a container with people who are on the same journey as you and they've gone the same places you have to a certain extent, right? Whereas you also don't have to cover already established ground that the people outside that community maybe haven't done. You can engage more, I want to say almost quicker, but quicker isn't necessarily the word for it, but deeper, maybe even more profound change and self-improvement, whatever that is, because you're surrounded by people who have gone that extra mile with you, and that creates, and there are tons of things, even if we get into, egregores and thought forms and any of the chaos magic kind of stuff, where you're creating that kind of field around a group of people where it's and that itself is influential because it raises sort of your general, connection, I guess you can say, whatever it is, right? But
it's worth also kind of listening to what people who are familiar with the system say. So, for example, with ayahuasca, one of the things that is often, is not absolutely the case, but it's often spoken of in a number of the syncretic religious and indigenous shamanic kind of settings with regard to this particular medicine, is that you can have an amazing vision, and that's brilliant. But that's your amazing vision. Ain't no point you telling everybody else about it. Not necessarily. There's a lot of, even with the kind of psychedelic renaissance and this kind of emphasis on integration. And when people talk about integration, they often mean talking about stuff. And there are plenty of examples that I can think of from both North and South and indeed Central America, where the standard practice is not to tell anyone about what you saw in your journey. Like, you did your journey, fantastic. Maybe you saw all kinds of exciting things. That doesn't really matter to me. What matters to me is how you are in the world, how you are with your children, with your colleagues, with your family, with the food that you eat, with the economic choices that you have, with the way you behave in relation to other people. That's actually what matters to me. I don't care whether or not you've seen like Superpower Metatron or some like groovy like multi-armed Buddha or, you know, Quetzalcoatl telling you that you're the son of God. I'm really not interested. What I'm interested in is how you behave as part of the social human community that you come back to. And being part of that community that you were saying that is already like on the same page, like listen to those people, because coming back from your ayahuasca pilgrimage or ayahuasca tourism experience and telling everyone else, many of the people who will have served you ayahuasca will say, don't bother talking about your stuff. It's not really important. It's not really significant. I mean, but, you know, that's not to say that you should never do so. Of course, there might be stuff that comes up that needs to be processed linguistically, needs to be processed with thoughtful and careful, intelligent and well-informed individuals. But mostly it's of no real importance, you know, unless you are part of like some kind of, you know, if you're in part of a deep therapeutic relationship, you probably do want to tell your therapist. But frankly, that's why you're paying them. They are being paid to listen to you bang on about your ayahuasca vision or about the dream you had last night. And hopefully that is a useful space in which that can happen. But whether or not you need to tell the dude who's serving you behind the checkout at Tesco that you've had this and mate, not relevant. What's relevant to the dude behind the checkout at Tesco is like, do you give them a friendly smile? Do you ask them how their day's been? Do you, bid them good day when you've gone and you're just like it's all right. It's fine.
You're a decent human being.
You're a decent human being. Exactly. That's what it comes down to. So also listen to what the community says. If the community of practice, and psychedelics is a great example of this, like a number of the people that I know involved in, let's call it the kind of communities that make use of peyote, they do a vision quest process. And the vision quests are like pretty hardcore. And I know a number of people who've, undertaken those things. And they don't tell me about exactly what happened in those vision quests, and I wouldn't ask because that's their thing, that's their journey, you know. What I'm more interested in is how we are together here and now, you know, and how that experience might inform you, hopefully for the better, to be within this human community.
Yeah. I completely agree. It's so weirdly like synchronistic that we're talking about this, because I've had like in the past like 2 months, I've had like a bunch of people who are in this exact position. So this podcast is going to be really helpful for them. So it's great that we're talking about it. Even on that note, one of the things I am always curious about in general, even from a magical perspective or an occultist perspective, is spirits as a whole. Like, as an occultist, as magicians, we work with spirits. And obviously when you're on some kind of psychedelic journey or you're on a vision quest, whatever, you are going to encounter things, whether they will be archetypes or whatever, that kind of thing. I've had discussion after discussion of what spirits are or where they come from, whether they're archetypes, whether they're independent beings in their own vibration, whatever it is. And we could talk about that if you want to, but at this point I'm more interested in what's the way of putting it? To what extent do you think those things affect a journey that you're having, or affect our life as occultists in general, whether they are archetypes or they are independent beings, you know, how we interact with them?
I mean, I think when we talk about the reality of these things, I often refer people to the story that Aleister Crowley, again, to name check our bad boy occultist, the Elon Musk of magic, that he wrote a story about a mongoose. Right. Anyway, there's you find it online somewhere. I think Alan Moore might refer to it. But basically, the point about this particular story about mongooses and snakes is there's a guy on the train, and he's met by another chap, and he says, you're traveling on the train, you've got this big basket, what you've got in the basket? And he says, it's a mongoose. And he says, well, why have you got a mongoose? I'm taking it to go to my brother. My brother is at the other end of the train line, and he's seeing snakes. And the dude says, yeah, but they're not real snakes. And the guy says, well, this isn't a real mongoose either. So the point is that by behaving in relation to these things as though they are beings, in the same way that I'm behaving in relation to you as though you're a separate being, there you are in, was it Kent? Yeah. So, you know, I'm not perceiving you as just like a collection of pixels on the screen with sound coming out the speaker. We interact in this kind of a way. Usually entities of some description turn up when there is some information to be provided, where it is most helpful if the information is provided by what appears to be an externally arising other entity. So often these things have like a message. They often come saying like, oh, I'm going to tell you something, right? Occasionally there's a dialogue. Occasionally there's actually like, you know, conversation, knowledge and conversation, but mostly they're there usually to tell you a bunch of stuff, to kind of like download some things. They appear with a face on because those are the things that we notice most in the world. The first things we notice when we're born is, if we're sighted individuals, is the shape of, you know, the two dots, whether it's the eyes or the nostrils. We notice faces. All I have to do is draw a circle, put two dots in it. It's immediately a face. We are geared up to respond to these things. So these beings, and I've got a particular sort of view about spirits, about like how, you know, in what way are they real? But they are certainly real experiences. And in magic, what we tend to do is we privilege the importance of the subjective experience. I met a spirit. Okay, let's not worry about like where it comes from. Is it in the tube? Is it outside the tube? Is it as a result of some temporal lobe epilepsy? It doesn't really matter. What matters is I met a spirit. Okay, so you met a spirit. Yes. Right. So how did it appear? What did it say? What did it do? How did you interact with it? Those are the questions that matter. Those last questions are the important ones.
Yeah.
And okay, so here I am in the universe. The universe is composed of innumerable parts that are all continuously in flow. How do I make sense of that? Well, perhaps what I'll do is I'll divide it into 4, because I can count to 4 relatively easily. And I will imagine it as a series of cherubs. Let's imagine that there's like a human, and there's a lion, and then there's an eagle, and there's a bull. Right, so immediately I've given the face to a whole complicated raft of things, you know, some of which are to do with the literal element of air and fire and water and earth, some of which are to do with very, very abstract concepts. But by giving it a face, now I can interact with it, because I'm a hominid and I interact with stuff with faces in it. You know, I mean, sometimes those things are difficult. There is the hideous paperclip and those early versions of Word there, you know, but nevertheless, by giving it a face, suddenly now we've got a new channel of communication. There's one of those, you know, those irritating chatbots that nearly always comes up with like, it's got a face, isn't it? Hasn't it? Because that means that this box is suddenly no longer a box, it's a person that we're interacting with. So the ontological status is of no real moment, at least not as far as the experience itself is concerned, the ceremony, the ritual, the interaction, the psychedelic trip. Afterwards, yeah, sure. Analyze it psychologically, analyze it in terms of, did I have a temporal lobe epileptic seizure? Is that what really happened? But in the interaction itself, we engage and we dialogue, or we very often listen to the spirit that arises, that tells us a thing. And that's perhaps, you know, spirits, I think any complex system of interrelated information that arises as an apparently external other is a spirit. And so those spirits that arise in this kind of form, they're there to communicate with us. They utilize the basic hominid kind of strategy that we have because of the way that our brains have developed. And in the moment of interaction, we suspend any disbelief about where they may come from or what their status might be, and we simply have that interaction. Afterwards, we criticize it, we analyze it, we break it down, we talk about it in different ways, and that's also incredibly valuable. You know, this is a little bit like, again, looping back to this thing of like folk magic and ceremonial magic or study. You know, we do the study. We say, wait, is this like a Jungian thing? Is this like a kind of Stargate, other universe kind of thing. We do we analyze, analytical process. The Solvay process is a thing, but the coagula, the coming together, the just allowing these things to exist in their own terms and appreciating them in that way, that's really the strategy of magicians.
Yeah, it's it's one of those things. I remember as well. We mentioned the LBRP earlier. Obviously, with the LBRP, we obviously call the general archangels each of the 4 quarters. And it was rather interesting because I wanted to challenge my own self-belief, with its own thing. Because I think there is another element of this where it's always been quite funny to me, because a lot of occultists seem to have a bit of religious trauma towards Christianity and anything that's sort of associated with Christian entities, whether it's angels or Yahweh in a sense, or any of the sort of general things. And then obviously Christians have religious trauma towards occultists because they think we're all devil worshippers or whatever it is, right? And I was talking to Justin Sledge on another podcast, and he was sort of saying the same thing. He's like, yeah, you guys really should just meet each other. Like, especially if you look in like the Solomonic stuff, like it's all mainly Christian or mainly Catholic, right? They're all using Christian spirits or Christian entities or God names or Judeo-Christian God names. And it was one of those things, because I wanted to challenge myself, because I even had it. I was like, okay, I acknowledge like I have some biases against Christianity in that sense as an occultist. So I wanted to challenge myself. I was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to spend a week and I'm going to pray the rosary. I'm going to go like full Catholic for like a week, and I'm going to like properly pray the rosary in a ritual context as well. So like I would generally, whenever I do rituals, I will start with, general purification procedures, whether it's a shower, whether it's anything else. And then I'll do the LBRP or maybe the middle pillar, whatever it is, as I'm going through. I went, okay, I'm going to scrap all of that for a week. And I'm going to just pray the rosary as my sort of initial purification before I do a ritual. And in doing so, I'll maybe I'll visualize some of the archangels as I'm praying the rosary, that kind of thing. And I ended up having, for me at least, with a subjective experience, a very similar, if not the same kind of experience as I had doing the LBRP, as I did with doing the rosary. So I was sitting there, I was like, and the rosary is easier to do, honestly, than the LBRP. So I was sitting there and I was like, I'm just like, for me, subjectively speaking, I can experience a spirit in that same way via doing the rosary more so than doing the LBRP. And I can experience subjectively the same kind of phenomena. So I'm just going to do that instead, because it's far easier, it's more practical for me to do. But it kind of raises this interesting question of it's kind of like psychological magic when we're working with spirits and we're visualizing things, different quarters, whether it's the watchtowers, the anything else, the archangels, anything, versus are we actually calling them via that? Is it an actual external entity that's coming in, or is it something that is like a download that we're connecting to that then it is? And it's an interesting kind of debate that I've had for myself. But I mean,
it's just again, it's like, is this in the tube or is this outside the tube?
Right, it's the same type of logical debate.
And the answer is yes. Yes, it's inside the tube. Yes, it's outside the tube. Yes, it's inside awareness. Yes, it doesn't. And yes, it doesn't really matter. I mean, I think certainly in terms of what you're talking about, the relationship between occultism and the dominant religious discourse of Christianity. I mean, we're fortunate of being in the place and the time that we are, that we can be occultists and we can be practicing occultists without, and there are plenty, we have to be mindful of the fact that there are plenty of places around the planet where that's still a huge, dangerous problem, potentially lethal in some states. For me, like when I did my Holy Guardian Angel work, or the first major phase of it, perhaps one might say, a lot of what that was about like reconnecting with my ancestral religion, which was a sort of vaguely lapsed Methodism. I mean, some members of my family a few generations back were quite kind of like heavily into this sort of primitivist, nonconformist Christianity. So part of, again, Crowley's thing where he talks about, if the pyramid would touch the stars, how broad must be its base. So we need to include these things. If I go, oh no, Christianity, that's all horrible, that doesn't make any sense. Same when I sat with the Native American folks in the peyote circle, and they used the term prayer, because prayer and that syncretic connection between Christianity as re-understood by the native people of the American plains, and then the kind of the peyote and the kind of the sacrament and the whole kind of process of this. Initially, I was like, prayer. Prayer. That's not like spells, is it? It's not like invocations. Invocations and spells, they're kind of cool. Prayer, that's like, oh God, please help me with things. And then, of course, because I was actually prepared to listen to what was actually going on, I recognized that what was really happening was that these prayers were what today we would probably call appreciation or gratitude practice. They were practices of bringing our attention to the good, bringing our attention to the good, bringing our attention to the things that are well. When we take the peyote, it's that kind of ecstatic medicine, obviously chemically very similar to ecstasy in many respects, very heart-opening. And by repeatedly bringing our attention to the things that are good in our lives, and I remember a peyote roadman, sort of, one of the people who runs the ceremony, saying this is the way we work. We summon up this big heart energy and we use this to push out all of the crap in our lives. When we do psychoanalysis, we bring it all the crap out and we look at it, we try and figure it out, and that's fine. Sometimes that's really valuable. But what we do is we bring up all this good and we use it to kind of basically, he actually said, we push all the shit out. Is what we do with this great open-heartedness. So prayer, at that point, I was kind of going, right, so what prayer is, one of the things that prayer is. And I remember even as a kid being, not hassled to do it, but like very gently encouraged when I was really little to kind of like pray for the well-being of people and thank God for these various things. And of course, I sort of, withdrew from that. I'm not doing that. I'm all dressed in black and I'm a god. Yeah. I'm in the 80s.
I'm an occultist.
I'm an occultist, me. And then, of course, this is actually just a human behavior which occurs in lots of religious settings and lots of different contexts. So if I can return to prayer and I can build prayer into the magic that I want to do, it is very powerful. It is very powerful. And part of the reason it's very powerful, arguably, is because for us as individuals, it's been the excluded. And when we can take the thing that was the lead, or what we thought was the lead, and we can transform it and bring it into our practice, we go, oh, turns out it's gold. Huh, who knew?
Yeah.
Who knew?
Yeah, no, it reminds me as well, because one of I've noticed this, and it always makes me laugh. A lot of the occultists that I've met in recent years, I've noticed as well that because there has been this kind of trend in occultism recently where Plato is now becoming a bit more widely known. And people are getting into Plato a lot more as occultists, which I think is absolutely brilliant, because I am first and foremost like Neoplatonist. I'm 100%, I love it. So like, this is great for me. I've actually noticed, it's really funny, a couple of occultists that I know, as they got deeper and deeper into Plato, they reconverted to Catholicism because they found that the two kind of streams of thought, especially sort of traditional Catholicism, because obviously anything that's derived from kind of like Thomas Aquinas, that kind of stuff, it was like Neoplatonism was such a huge influence on the historical church that actually the conception of God that a lot of traditional Catholics have is actually far more Platonic than it is like biblical.
Yeah,
and that it's not aware that they don't that's where it's come from. So like it's just such an interesting, curious thing. It's like I have occultists, some of which began their occult path in what we can objectively say is somewhat darker things, like very, very sort of theistic currents of Satanism or whatever else, very kind of traditional stuff. Then they went into Plato, got really deep into that, and then reconverted because it was the same kind of idea. And it's just such a funny shift of awareness of people that I'm noticing, that the more people get interested in Plato, the more they're kind of realizing that actually it's the same kind of religion and the same kind of, it's the same truth, the same mystical truth that's being articulated in all these religions. And it's absolutely fascinating.
And I think for me, it's also like my way of thinking of these things is it's about like maintaining the flexibility. So because this is about the mystery, and because the mystery is by definition unknowable, we might decide, and I myself have kind of gone through these, the phases where I'm like, Thelema, that's the thing, or like Wicca, that's the thing, the medicine work, that's the thing, and it's like, no, actually, I don't want to just eat Italian food or Chinese food. I actually quite like having a range of different stuff, and I know that there are seasons as well. in the wintertime, I want to, living in the latitude that I do, I want to eat potatoes and pies and things like this. In the summertime, I want to eat different food. And as an occultist, for me, it's about like maintaining that flexibility. So maintaining that that questioning and that uncertainty. You know, it's like there's that lovely essay by Crowley where he called "The Soldier and the Hunchback," which is, you know, hugely overworked because a lot of his stuff is just like rambly nonsense because he was on too much coke. But the basic idea that essentially that the magical life, the mystical life, the engaged spiritual life is a series of the soldier and the hunchback. So the soldier is like the exclamation mark, and you go, ah, and then you go, the hunchback is like going, huh, and that's how it is. And as long as you can maintain that, like that oscillation between these things, that's where the flexibility happens. That's why, you know, the magician is the juggler with all these different paradigms, again, to use a chaos term, but all these different kind of approaches and all these different understandings. Is it psychological? Yes. Is it parapsychological? Yes. Is it, you know, it's all of these things that we work with. And to maintain that flexibility so that, again, you know, as the Taoists would say, we hopefully aspire to have the wisdom of the sage and the flexibility of a child, you know, or of an infant. And that's, I think, where magic dwells.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'm also conscious I've kept your time now for like an hour and a half, so we can start wrapping up, I suppose. That sounds like a great place to start wrapping up. But it reminds me of... There's a constant meme that sort of keeps going around and comes up every now and again, even in chaos magic circles. Like there's a pendulum that's swinging between things. It's like everything is magic, nothing is magic. It's like mystical revelation, insanity. like your magical journey is just you constantly going back and forth on that pendulum between like insanity, revelation, everything and nothing, constantly going back. It's like that entire motion is the sweet spot for like
it's this, isn't it? You know, it's like it's Solvay and Coagula. It's like this one being, this one thing is this flow process between this analytical splitting apart, study, all of those kinds of things, and then this Coagula bringing together this poetic, this the stuff that escapes codification and becomes the ineffable. And it's like the process is holding these two things in balance, or holding these things in a dynamic equilibrium is probably a better way of putting it. And that's why we need community around us. That's why we need a community of practice, because we're doing this stuff. We're also doing it often under sometimes quite challenging circumstances, individually or culturally. You know, if you haven't got anxiety or depression at this point in the story, you're probably not paying attention. So
it's common for occultists.
Yeah. So you know, having community around us and having the kind of that support while we do that work, and for that work then to have meaningful effects in terms of the way that we are with other people in the world. That's where it's at.
And so it's at, and that's the true. It's the true philosopher's stone, the true beauty. I guess we're going for that sense of community, I suppose. Brilliant. All right, Julian, thank you so much for coming on. It's been brilliant.
Chris, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me. Really, really appreciate it.
All right, I'll talk to you later, man.
All right, my friend. See you soon.
Right. Have a good week.